Hello, this is Fred Viner. Recently I had the great pleasure of talking with composer David Lumsdaine. We sat in his sunlit study overlooking the Ouse and reflected for nearly 2 hours on his extraordinary life and career. Our sprawling conversation led us through many topics, including his musical education growing up in Australia, his lifelong fascination with birdsong and soundscapes, and his recent struggles with hearing and memory loss. Lumsdaine was born in Sydney in 1931 and was educated at Sydney University and the New South Wales Conservatorium. He continued his studies in 1953 when he moved to England to work with Matthias Scheiber. I was keen to learn about his early musical education and how that contrasted with the more rigorous training he went on to receive in the UK. To kick things off, though, I asked what first drew him to composition.
As long as I can remember, I have been playing with music, and yeah. So it was very, very unsophisticated music in my household. That was my mother was an up-country lass, and that really meant something in those days because her family was. They were the people who built the village. Built, and they had to make all their own amusements and so on. And mother was one of the. Well, she had two talents. She was a great horsewoman, horse girl actually, and she was the musician around the place, who provided music as well as being everybody's favourite jockey at the local races and that kind of thing. Anyway, that was it was that kind of country music and church music, which was my background for many years. I found everything else out gradually myself as I grew up in curiosity. There was no composition training except from my music teacher at school, who all he did really was to encourage me and get me composing for school plays and things like that. It was more encouragement from him, and that I was right at the beginning of the music course at Sydney University. And it was fun, but there was not a great deal there at that point. There soon would be, but at that point it was just starting. And the main thing was to get to England. I was really recommended to get working with Matthias Scheiber. He was very, very good. He was absolutely down. He found me very, very unsophisticated still. And I think he cordially disliked my music, but he still taught me. And it was quite tough. A rigorous training that I had never had in Australia. But good. It was a pruning more than anything else.
Lovely.
But the kind of experience that I had in Sydney, which was absolutely marvellous, was being able to sit in on all the rehearsals of the Sydney Symphony Orchestra. And they were very, very good at that stage. Goossens was a marvellous orchestral trainer. He was an okay conductor, but he was a marvellous orchestral trainer. And there were loads of visiting conductors. And to prepare a score, get scores out from the library and prepare them beforehand, and then sit in up at the back of the orchestra for those rehearsals. That was a marvellous education in itself. There was another big influence in Australia, which was at third hand, but it meant it was a terrific shake-up. One day I was listening to the radio while I was doing some preparation, and this very latest recording was played of Britain's Serenade, and the whole thing knocked me. I still think it is one of the most perfect works ever composed. It's extraordinary work. Britain's use of triads, I think it remained rather odd and very, very personal, and that had quite an influence on what I was doing at that time.
Once in the UK, Lumsdaine established himself with such works as Kelly Ground and Flights for solo piano and Mandalas 1 and 2 for ensemble. He is also the author of several orchestral works, for example Hagoromo, which was commissioned by the BBC for the 1975 Prom series. Throughout his life he has worked with some of the world's leading symphony and chamber orchestras, ensembles and soloists. Out of these many rich collaborations, which then stood out? Composer-pianist Roger Smalley quickly came up, and the piece Lumsdaine wrote for him, the 1966 work Kelly Ground.
It was written for him, and it was, I think, he had something like 3 weeks to learn it before it was an BBC invitation concert, and he did a gorgeous performance of it. Yes. Absolutely gorgeous. Yes. People like that, and Roger also did Flights, and another person I loved working with was Jane Manning, with the singers. Jane was, she was marvellous. Collaborators in the other sense, when I was in my 20s, I loved working with Peter Porter, my friend, Australian poet. And we did a lot of work together, which was not published and was indeed destroyed. But there are some works which still live on from that period. But in general, collaboration means a great deal. Again, I think it's sharing with somebody, sharing the responsibility for work. I should have mentioned one of the longest collaborations that I've had is with Gemini and the players in Gemini. Yeah. Some of the works that I still remember vividly, because again, you lose the memory of so many of the things. There's a feeling for them, but the actual music itself has gone. Yes. But I absolutely loved working with the Garden of Earthly Delights. I loved that piece very much. There's a recording of it which Diego Masson and my friend Boo made with the Australian Youth Orchestra, and it was absolutely fantastic what Masson got out. Yeah. They had done loads and loads of rehearsal time. And Masson worked with them. He pushed them far beyond anything I could have imagined to get to get detail and
Had they played any of that sort of repertoire before?
no.
Even better.
Anyway, that was great fun, and I perhaps just loved that piece, particularly because of that.
Composers have drawn inspiration from nature and birdsong for centuries, but few could claim to have done the field work that Lumsdaine has. Over several decades he accumulated a vast number of wildlife recordings, many of which are held in the British Library's National Sound Archive. I asked him about his fascination with soundscapes and birdsong.
I became fascinated by birdsong, by individual songs, and wanting to analyze them. At the same time, I was very lucky in having a friend who, this was a great bookham, who was a good both amateur musician, and we used to play a lot together, and a very, very good amateur ornithologist. And for a number of springs in particular, we'd be up the weekend, 4 o'clock, out, we'd meet and go through the countryside. We're living in the very rich countryside at that time. And he taught me the names of these songs, which was the names of the birds. And of course, once again, it was a different kind of music. It was a music to me, but something entirely different. And that experience, learning that, has remained with me ever since. It was. But as I realized then that as a child there were a number of soundscapes which were not just birds, but places like my first home was on 52 Good Hope Street, Paddington, which rises up from the harbour and on a very steep hill, and we overlooked the harbour. And the soundscape of that harbour in those days, I mean, Sydney was just so much smaller. Yeah. On the Sunday morning, you'd hear the lions and the zoo opposite roaring for their when they were being fed. The foggy mornings with all the different the different booms of the ships as they were passing up and down the harbour. That soundscape was an extraordinary one. Yes. It's disappeared, of course, nowadays. And just things like hearing the squeals of the tram wheels. There was a very, very sharp corner about a quarter of a mile away from our place. And if I was up high on second or third floor and listening out to the west, you'd hear the squeal of the. I mean, it's almost impossible to think about this nowadays in the dense, awful sounds of Sydney. It's a typical city, except it's got every bit of air conditioner going in the summer.
Definitely.
Just, I mean, it really seals up the ears, sound of air conditioners. Oh.
To finish, we spoke about Lumsdaine's wife, Nicola Lefanu, and the role they've played in each other's creative lives.
Well, I can start off by saying that one of the saddest things is to have lost our musical. I can't follow what Nicola's doing any longer. And we can't do all the things that we used to do. But the collaboration was never compositional. There were, I would often talk to Nick about the way I was working in a particular piece, because she was fascinated, and at the same time I could be clarifying my own ideas. We're often our first critics in a way, but I think we are rather generous to one another in terms of hard criticism.
Yes.
But there was a great deal of mutual encouragement in whatever work was going on. I loved, for instance, following Nicola's many dramatic works with her, and that meant a great deal. She would always be at my rehearsals. Yeah. And indeed, as my hearing began to go, I became very dependent on her, and also on Tony Gilbert, who had very good ears. Yeah. I felt balanced because although I could get a great deal still as the hearing went, I needed another person there to actually balance performances. Yes. Yeah. And that was an enormous help. Yeah. So we have, in short, we have never had any any squabbles about music. We have squabbles are very, very rare, and they're always operatic and over quickly. I mean, I'm sure the people next door will think there's an opera every now and then. Yeah. And then the thing generally finishes up in gales of laughter.
Lovely. Thanks for listening. For more information on David Lumsdaine and his music, follow the links in the video description below. Bye for now.